Hello friends, good morning and welcome to the EduSite Network. Our topic of discussion is part of our ongoing series on writing in India, and our specific topic is recent developments in Hindi criticism. And friends, for this very lecture we have with us in our studio our subject expert Dr. Anand Prakash, retired professor of English University of Delhi. With this very brief introduction, I welcome sir to our studio. So thank you so much for coming, and with this I also request you to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you, Roshi, and welcome viewers. Today's topic is exactly literally topical in today's context, because the way literature is being discussed in the last 60 years and particularly in the last 30 years, that is what we will be talking about. And when one talks about one's own time, then one faces a difficulty. The difficulty is whether one is able to properly grasp and understand the surroundings, the nature and character of those surroundings, and how they affect literature. And since the discussion today would be on literary criticism, it is further interesting and significant that the idea, the thought, the perspective, the value system is slightly abstracted from a text and discussed more or less independently. That is what criticism is for me. And in the previous discussion, I talked about the first phase of Hindi criticism, and I made that remark, and that remark is to be kept in mind when we discuss this recent developments topic today. I said that the first phase, in fact, is the phase that can be called the golden phase, because at that in that period, in that span of time, Hindi criticism not merely came into its own, but also started influencing a great number of people, including writers. It's a difficult thing to do for any critical area. And one knows, that in English, this kind of criticism was written only in the mid 18th century and early 19th century. And after that, one saw a kind of decline in English criticism itself. So in Hindi, the same thing happened. Literary writing began in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and along with that, ideas became crystallized from which angle one could look at the literary works and think about them and talk about them. And in 1920s, for instance, as I discussed, the first history of Hindi literature was written, and that stands out even today as a model of critical writing, keeping in mind the sequence of historical phases. I referred to Ramchandra Shukla and many other critics later. And then, from 1940 onwards, the second and the last phase, because it comes up to the present period, that phase comes into existence, and this phase has its own nature and character. 1940 is the year when things become very political in India, when the main political party in the country, Congress, decides to give a call to the rulers, saying that they should leave India, they should quit India, and that India would from now onwards should be considered an independent republic. So that happens sometime in the early 1940s, and then Hindi criticism also is in its elements. For instance, realism has already reached its zenith. It's highest point. We have with us in the 1940s. Of course, the person is dead, but his writing is very contemporary at that time, Premchand. He dies in 1936. But then he has set good standards of realism. And then you have other writers, I discussed them elsewhere. And these writers, they tell us about the times in which they compose their works. and they make us aware about those times in a manner that is unthinkable today. So when I discuss the present phase, the recent developments that happened, then this is the background. And I in fact said yesterday, but the previous lecture, but today I say it with this kind of distinct view of Hindi literary thought, that in the 1950s, after 1940, things start happening one after another, and they pick up speed. One can't really keep track of the developments that happened in 1940. So many things happened. And 1947, when the riots, communal riots occur, then people start talking about them also. And literature of the period, it gets influenced by the shocking developments in India at that time on the ideological and political plane. So this development, which I want to refer to right in the beginning, is the development of independence in India. And as soon as independence occurs, it starts taking inspiration from. It's not a very pleasant aspect. It starts taking inspiration from the Western world, and starts talking about growth and development, and starts talking in a language that is not as committed, as humanistic, as rational as was the national movement. So there is a kind of a deviation from the national movement in the 1950s itself. Of course, that deviation cannot occur beyond a point, because writers are aware that they have seen that period when people were together and then they are fighting a common enemy called the British imperialism. That is not possible. But somehow things are happening in the subterranean area. For instance, people now start wondering about the relevance of literature in the sense in which it was relevant in the 1930s and 40s. So they start wondering about it. And why should they wonder? They should not wonder. They should in fact carry the tradition forward. They should be still more critical of the forces that kept inequality alive in the 20th century. So, and now in fact was the time when people should rise in some kind of protest against the forces of inequality in the country. But that is not happening. And in fact, in literature and in literary criticism also, a new trend has emerged, and that trend is taking inspiration from what can be called the Cold War theory, the Cold War ideology, the Cold War emphases of literature. What are these emphases in the 1950s that I associate with Cold War? The Hot War ended in 1945-46, Second World War, and after that, different countries regrouped to carry on the fight that was there in the 1930s also in the pre-war period in a different manner. So now the war will not be hot war, it will be a cold war. Cold war means things will happen behind the scenes. And I don't have to go into the politics of it, but let me share this with you, that in literature a new emphasis is emerging, and this emphasis is not there merely in writing. In writing it can't happen all of a sudden. So people start expecting writers to follow a formula, and that formula, the new formula, which is a Cold War formula, is that ideas should be kept out of the purview of literature, literary writing. So no more ideas. So if one is writing, then one should write only about human experience, and one should look for the answers to present problems not merely within the country, but at the international level. Now, international level doesn't mean the socialist countries, which are now quite a few in number. It merely asks the writers to look at the literary trends that were there in European writing. And European writing in the post-war period had that particular phantom called the theatre of the absurd, or the writing of the absurd. And in the 1950s, people start saying, let's attack meaning, let's talk about absurdity, let's talk about meaninglessness, let's talk about a kind of vacuity in life, emptiness in life. And this cannot be done suddenly, so it will take time for things to catch up in India. But how can India take inspiration from the West, and particularly the writing of the absurd, is the question that one should have asked. And the media at that time, the newspapers, the magazines, etc., they do not talk about realism, for instance. They do not talk about commitment. They do not talk about change that is required in society and that should be reflected in literature. They are not talking about it. And those who do, those who want to, these people are kept out of the publication field. They are not published. They are not given a chance to express themselves clearly against the new forces of the Cold War. So this situation is developing in the 1950s, and one sees that in critical thought, things like Nayi Kahani and Nayi Kavita, they have come into existence, and one starts wondering as to what is Naya. Things have to be continuous, and if something new is there in the early 20th century, that new should be further strengthened. In fact, 20th century writing in Hindi particularly is a very new kind of writing. It's writing about the common masses. It is writing about the regions. It's writing about the poor people, and it's a writing which talks of ideas and talks of politics and talks of women's emancipation and liberation. It talks about that. It talks about the necessity of fighting against the common enemy of British imperialism. I have in the series I made it clear. But then in 1950s, writers are expected not to talk about those things at all. So these things are under attack, and this is the recent. I call it recent in the sense that in the beginning of the period that starts with independence, this kind of emphasis has occurred. And
Sir, please allow me to interrupt you at this point. I have been thinking of posing an idea or a question that you just told us that from 1950s onwards there was a sort of expectation that one will take inspiration from the West and probably talk or comment on things like the theatre of the absurd. Whereas my contention is that during that time India was also grappling with its own issues, and you all talked about realism and humanism, and these are issues which take precedence over talking about the ideas surfacing in the West. And you also mentioned that people who wanted to talk about these things were suppressed. So it comes as quite a surprise to think of things that sort of are not too relevant to our society are being imposed, and people expected to follow that formula.
I couldn't agree with you more. This is exactly what happened in the 1950s. And let me, taking help from your question, let me also, say that this is the period when education is striking roots in India. This is when the departments of literature are being started. This is when appointments are being made, and syllabi and courses, etc., are being framed. And at this point of time, emphasis has to be of a different kind, because now there is a new set of rulers and determinants in India, and they don't want things to become realistic, because then they might pose a threat to the powers that be at that time. So it is this, and when one is establishing a department of literature, literary studies, for instance, an English department and a Hindi department and other regional languages departments, etc., then the models are straight away lifted from the Western universities. And Western universities at that point of time have already started, putting towards the margins, pushing towards the margins, emphases that reigned supreme in the latter half of the 19th century, and they have become totally modernist. And that kind of modernism is coming in the garb of the Cold War here. And I can give specific critical examples. These I want to share with you. For instance, in the Cold War scheme of things, the important thing in literature is not the intent of the writer, it's not the purpose of the writer, it's not the personality of the writer, it's not the writer's approach to his or her society. What is important in the 1950s, and the idea is straight away lifted from the Western universities, the emphasis has to be entirely and totally on the text. And how is the text governed? And this is a literary criticism idea, that literature is text. Literature is a book. Literature has a kind of a beginning. It is a composition which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that you cannot move out of the area of the text in this form. So there is a sequence of words, there is a sequence of sentences, there is a sequence of chapters, there is a beginning, middle, and end, as I said. And if one has to discuss literature, then one should not refer to anything outside the text. So this is what is being now promoted as an important literary idea, as an important critical idea, and it has its own logic. And if you are as a critic, if you are supposed to talk about the text, then what will you discuss? You can't discuss the problems which are reflected in problems of life which are reflected, in the writing of the period, because then you will be going outside the text. So a text, whatever the text says, has to be commented upon only in a manner that the foregrounding is done in the case of the word. So most of the criticism then would be linguistic criticism. It will be explaining the words, etc., and their connection with one another, and there will be a theory behind it. And when it comes to issues, then those issues have to bring in the interests of society at the time. So they have to be kept out. So the text is important. The author is not important. This is what is being said again and again. And how much of it goes home, goes into the minds of the readers and others, that will take time to evolve. But then emphases are being changed from the earlier kind of discussions about literature to this new level. So this is a new development, that now literature will be discussed from the point of view of the text. So there is a, for instance, there will be no context. So you can't say that the book was written in 1950 and this was a period when some people organized themselves along communal lines, and they went about all those things. This point will not be discussed. What will be discussed is how the character suffers, what is the experience of the character, what does the character feel, and what is the nature of the feeling. And in the name of nature of the feeling, one starts going more and more into those areas of the mind, which have remained unexplored for a long time, and which will remain unexplored for quite some time later. And these are important issues, but in the 1950s, the important issues are of inequality, are of discrimination, against women and against Dalits at that time, and there are problems of law, etc. And literature of the third world, of a third world country, an ex-colony, has to grapple with these issues, but then that is not allowed in the literary thought of the period. So the first point is that text is at the center of discussion so far as criticism is concerned, and there is a denial and a rejection of the existing emphases and paradigms, including the philosophical and psychological. Let me share this with you, that in 1930s itself, certain trends had emerged in Hindi literary thought, and those trends were that literature should not be too much social, because that doesn't give any freedom to the individual to develop in the circumstances. The writer is talking about society all the time, and the characters remain in the background, and the characters' mental processes are not probed. This is what some writers had started doing themselves. I can name only two authors here. Jainendra Kumar, for instance, started talking about philosophy in the 1940s, etc. And there is another person called Joshi, Ilachandra Joshi. He also brought in some kind of psychology there. But then what happened in the 1950s is that even psychology and philosophy were not allowed to be discussed, because they definitely will take the issue beyond the limits of the literary work, and the critic and the thinker and the interpreter would confine himself or herself only to the discussion of the text in this way. So psychology also is out, philosophy also is out, because through philosophy and psychology sometimes you can bring in ideology, and ideology is a kind of anathema in the 1950s. Then this is there in the 1950s, and the manifestation is of Nai Kahani Alochana, the Nai Kavita Alochana, and this Alochana talks only about the individual's experience, and the individual is generally one individual, and then there is also a kind of a recurring mention of what is called authenticity. That this word is a critical word. This is a word which puts pressure on the writer to remain authentic. Authentic means you can prove that this is what is real. And how can one prove that this is what is real? For instance, if I write about a village and I don't belong to a village, then my writing is not authentic, because I don't know what the village is. And if I am of the middle class and I am talking about an industrialist, I cannot talk about the industrialist because I am not an industrialist myself. I cannot, for instance, as a male in the 1950s, discuss in literary criticism or in the context of literature. I can't discuss the question of women because I am a male, and that way this is called authentic writing. Authentic writer is that writing where one is familiar with it, which means what? It means that the writer will talk only about his or her own experiences, which means the writer will not extend the scope of one's writing to beyond one's limits of knowledge and understanding. And knowledge and understanding are defined in terms of one's direct knowledge of the things that one sees around oneself all the time. That's why Nayi Kahani and Nayi Kavita starting around 1950 and going quite strongly up to 1960 or so, this Kahani and Kavita will talk only about the writer, oneself. And if the writer is talking about oneself, then there is no variety, then there are no clashes, then there are no conflicts, there is no complexity. And instead of complexity, what one has is obscurity. So things are not complex, they offer a challenge, they are obscure, and only the writer will tell what the meaning is, and the writer is asked not to tell the meaning because meaning is not allowed. So imagine the kind of the situation that occurs in Nayi Kahani and Nayi Kavita, and a large number of critical discussions happen in this period, and only a few critics, like I refer to Muktibodh again and again. Muktibodh writes a book at that point of time, criticism, and the book is called Nayi Kavita Ka Atma Sangharsh. This is a book where he says that Nayi Kavita is struggling with itself. There is a kind of struggle with self in Nayi Kavita, and that struggle with self will manifest in the issues that Nayi Kavita is going to raise in the body of its writing, and those issues will put pressure on the writer to take cognizance of them more and more, and whether that would succeed or not. This is the point that Muktibodh would be raising in this book in the critical terminology. So,
sir,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you,
No,
but
not at all. That will help me explain things better. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Talking about this idea where the writer will talk only about his or her experiences, which sort of makes it to seem like an autobiography or say a very limited perspective, as I just said. So how would that become very interesting to somebody else who's reading it, just trying to learn about somebody's life, and there's no insight about the society or any kind of issue? So did the popularity of such works last, because perhaps it becomes very limiting in a large sense and not enriching for the reader or even educating to a certain extent?
This is the crux that I want to convey viewers, that Urvashi has asked. Actually writing has become confined to the experiences of the writer, and the writer is talking about oneself, and how can this appeal to a larger body of readers? This is the question. And the dangerous thing that has happened in the 1950s is that more and more readers are taken away from serious literature. Serious literature is talking about these things only. So the kind of appeal that literature had in the time of the national movement, that appeal is gone. Now literature is confined to the discussion in the classroom, and only those people read the writing of the day who have the books in the course. So the teacher knows, and the students are supposed to follow him or her, the teacher, and outside the classroom nobody is discussing these books at all. Now tell me, who are the Nayi Kahani writers in Hindi? You should ask yourself this question. If you are not a student of literature, you would not be able to tell. Let me tell you the writers of Nayi Kahani. There is a person called Rajendra Yadav. He is known more as a editor of Hans, and that too in the 1980s. And he had moved out of the mold of Nayi Kahani then, and he had become socially oriented. So one knows him only when he became active outside literature. But when he was writing his own short stories in Hindi, Mohan Rakesh was writing short stories. Nobody knows Mohan Rakesh as a writer of short stories today outside the classroom. People know him as a playwright. The Aadhe Adhure play that he wrote, and that is because that play was shown, and there he was compelled to talk about a middle class family and of course all those things. So what I say is that in the name of Nayi Kahani, whatever was written at that point of time remained confined to the textbooks, remained confined to the books available in the libraries, and very few people would go to the library to find out as to what the writer felt, what the writer experienced, or what the character representing the writer experienced. So in fact, the writer and the characters, they became together, and the character would not be away from the writer, conflicting with the views of the writer, because that would be inauthentic. The authentic thing is that the writer knows in the garb of the character, the writer is himself there, so he will talk the authentic stuff. So this is exactly what is the harm. Literature is being consistently taken away from the reading public, and Virginia Woolf in the 1920s and 30s was known for a book where she talked about the common reader. Now that common reader is being reduced to a minority in the 1950s. Hindi doesn't have a common reader in the 1950s and 60s because the writing available doesn't interest him or her. So this is the problem, the viewers, that happens, and it's a development, that we can't afford to ignore. And it is because of this, that when I talk about literary work written in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, or the last decade, or the present decade, which is in its middle, then most of you, if you are not a student of Hindi writing, will not know what I am talking about. So it has its seeds in the changing emphases, and I never tire of bringing in Premchand again and again. Premchand actually gets a rebirth in the 1970s and 80s, but at this point of time, Premchand is forgotten by the readers because the critics, Hindi critics, do not talk about. I said it in the previous discussion. Critics do not talk about Premchand in the 1950s. In fact, they say, oh, that writer, he only talked about the village, and he didn't have the knowledge of the complexity of the city life. And why should we talk about the village today? India is developing, India is being industrialized, India is a country of cities now more and more. That trend is coming up. Therefore, Premchand is not relevant, and he lacks complexity. He is a simple writer, and some people dubbed him a kissa go, a person who tells stories. So he is a teller of tales, and a teller of tales has no place in the complex writing of literature. This is how Premchand was being defined in the 1950s, and this development in criticism owed its existence to the emphasis of the Cold War values and the Cold War thoughts in the 1950s that were being popularized at a quite large level. Is there something that you'd like to say about this? That Hindi writing is no more, actually this is true about European writing in general, because most of the writing has now shifted from the common platform to the departments. So there are experts, there are critics, but there are no readers. What do you say to this?
Sir, I would definitely agree with that. And when you gave the example of Mohan Rakesh, most people that have read the text have done this through classroom readings, and nobody has actually gone to the library and read his Aadhe Adhure. So definitely I would agree with that, and I am surprised to know that people had to say that Premchand lacked complexity, and they had tried to shun him away. But thankfully for a brief period of time, because you mentioned that there was a rebirth in 1970s and 80s.
Yes. In fact, and in one of the discussions earlier, viewers, I called it afterlife. There is afterlife of Premchand. Yes. He was reborn, let's say, in 1980, when his first centenary was being celebrated, and after that, of course, it's Premchand all through. So that is because he is a common man's writer. He is a writer who is quite popular among the masses, and he is so complex. If you start analyzing the dialogues, the comments, the ironies, the hidden satire, the innuendos and all those things, and you realize that Premchand is saying so many other things, which are hidden beneath the surface. So there is a surface, and there are layers beneath the surface, and those layers, come out into the open only when one focuses upon Premchand as a writer who is talking about life in general, and he knows that life, and he knows that life not as a point of information, but the way he captures, the characters and their mental states. Those mental states suggest, that this kind of life would have existed. So in fact, Nayi Kahani and Nayi Kavita and all those theories would fail in front of Premchand, because Premchand is actually a very complex author, and new meanings of Premchand are being seen today by critics and serious readers. That is because he is able to capture the reality not through information, but through representation of situations where different points of view clash. Anyway, that's a topic of literary criticism. But then we have moved away from 1940s into the 50s and 60s. So viewers, this is where I'd like to shift from the 1950s and 60s. Of course, there was in Hindi writing around 1960 a kind of reaction to Nayi Kahani and Nayi Kavita, and people, writers themselves, they started saying that if we have to be critical of ideas, then we have to be critical of the Nayi Kahani ideas also, or Nayi Kavita ideas also, and they became totally promoters and votaries of the writing of the absurd. Nayi Kahani and Nayi Kavita were still talking about some experience, some important insights, some authenticity, but then in reaction partly, and partly also because in 1960s the Western idea, the Western view of the reality of the absurd had reached India quite clearly, either through translation or through direct reading of English, and the writing of the absurd in Hindi manifested itself in the 1960s, and this was called Akahani and Akavita instead of the writing of the absurd. So it's not a story, it's not a poem, and they were writing poetry and they were writing poems. So they were going against themselves. So this kind of a reaction occurred to the ideology of the Cold War, and the Cold War by that time would have also shifted its emphasis to other things, like they would be promoting writing of the absurd more than the writing the history or time or realism, etc. Were not relevant. So 1960s this happened, and one can understand the same thing that I have said, literary criticism of 1950s and 60s, also in the political context of India. This is to be kept in mind. For instance, in the 1950s, a kind of economic policy is being adopted. That is the economic policy of public sector, and public sector appears to be somewhat socialist. It is somewhat socialist in the sense that at least the middle class and the professionals, they are getting jobs, and they are also developing a kind of economic structure. But then, so far as the rural India is concerned, that remains outside the purview of development in 1950s and 60s. So this is the kind of economic reality that is happening at that time. So there are 5-year plans, and those 5-year plans in the 1950s, as economists tell me today, would be gearing towards meeting the interests of the industrialists who are private entrepreneurs, and steel, for instance, will give us profits. I'm just talking as a literary critic. Steel, for instance, would be produced in the public sector, but it will be sold to the private sector and at a subsidized price, which means that the public sector is at the service of the private sector at that time. So public sector became, I still support public sector, and I'm somewhat critical of the private sector, but then this is the kind of policy, and people were not happy with it, because writers could feel that as India developed, its poverty also developed. Development, it increased. The inequalities were further increased in the 1950s and 60s, because of which the Indian landscape was affected, the Indian political landscape was affected. And this is to be kept in mind. I think I discussed it in other areas. But then in 1970s, India comes to a kind of economic and political standstill, and because of which in 1975 a state of emergency is imposed, and all political institutions are closed more or less. The parliament is not functioning after the imposition of emergency. And there are writings in India. One writing is Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, which talks about the emergency, and there are other writings also. And people start suffering because of the policies that finally failed in the context of India. What was literary criticism doing in the 1970s is the question that I want to introduce. And one says, that Hindi criticism in the 1970s became aware of its limitations. It started feeling, that Hindi readers are getting more and more isolated, more and more away from the writers, and the writers are not known outside, as I said earlier, the classroom. The magazines, regular magazines sponsored by big corporate houses till that time, they don't publish pro people writing. And still, either it is the old veterans of the Nai Kahani or Nai Kavita, or people who have already who have been affected by it among the young generation. They are being published, and the person who wants to talk about one's own reality, this person is feeling totally neglected in the 1970s. Because of which, what happens is, interestingly, in the 1970s, one has the emergence of little magazines. I talked about it, and these little magazines are more thought oriented. They are more critical. They have critical discussions in them, and there is some writing also done. That writing is not even half of the pages of the little magazine. Little magazines are brought out by individual authors and critics. Little magazines do not print more than 1,000 copies. In fact, sometimes the copies are 200 or 300. They are being distributed, sometimes free, sometimes with a little cost. People invest their own money into it, and one after another, these little magazines are emerging. But then, in these little magazines, the writers have started thinking about the problems that I raised in the context of 1950s and 60s. So, little magazines in 1970 emphasize again the idea of time, the idea of realism, the idea of meaning in writing. So the imbalance that had occurred in the 1960s and 50s, that imbalance is being corrected now, and writers have started saying that one has to go back to the values of the national movement, where there was that sense of collectivity, there was a sense of assertion of the common person, man or woman, and the idea of social justice, the idea of equality. It is these things that are being emphasized now in the pages of the literary magazines. And because most of the writers now are shifting towards the little magazines, and some of them very openly announced in the 1970s. And this is because of the critical emphasis that shifted from the earlier period to this. They announced openly that they are boycotting the commercial magazines, the non-little magazines. And commercial magazines were brought out by, for instance, Times of India, by Hindustan Times Group, etc. So those magazines were boycotted, which was unthinkable, in the 1960s and 50s. But then in 70s, this development also happened, that little magazines came forward. They started talking about the relevance of meaning in life, meaning in literature, and they started arguing about it. The other thing which I will take up maybe in the next discussion will be about debates. I am not going into the debates today. So I am just talking about this new development in the 1970s, that in these little magazines, the relevance of literature, the meaning of literature, etc., is being discussed with intensity. And with the editorials are long. In the other magazines, in the commercial magazines, in the magazines brought out by the corporate houses, there are no editorials, or they are very, very short length editorials. But so far as little magazine is concerned, sometimes the editorials are as long as 20 pages. There is a magazine, that was brought out by a writer, a critic called Chandrabhushan Tiwari. And the magazine came from Bihar and not from Patna. It came from a smaller town than Patna, Ara. and the magazine had the first 20-30 pages by Tiwari himself, and Tiwari was talking about the trend that is required in Hindi writing. So a critic was bringing out a magazine, and he was giving editorial comments about the matter, that he had published in that particular issue, and this was a new kind of a trend in Hindi writing then. There were other magazines like I can cite the example of Katha, a magazine that the famous Hindi and a Nai Kahani short story writer. He he changed sides then. He ceased to be a Nai Kahani writer in the 1970s, and he brought out this Katha. It was once again a little magazine. I think in 4 or 5 years of the 1970s, he brought out only 4 or 5 issues of it, which means only on a yearly basis. You would say it's a quarterly, but it never became a quarterly except the first 2 issues. And there, he was doing the same thing. He was, of course, not writing long editorials, but then 80% of the matter of Katha at that point of time was critical. So criticism, which was not given any space in the previous magazines except in comments, etc., or there would be just 1 or 2 articles in the magazines. In the 1970s, the 70-80% of the pages would be devoted to criticism. So Katha is another magazine, and this magazine turned literature in the direction of what I call by the common name realism, and he was carrying on debates which I'll touch upon later. So 70s have this period, and this gave it 2 things happened. One thing, that some of the old writers who were not finding space in the so-called commercial magazines earlier, they started coming towards, attracted towards the little magazines. I can cite particularly the example of the famous and a very popular progressive poet called Nagarjun. So Nagarjun I had not seen much, and till 1970, and suddenly Nagarjun started appearing in little magazines. He started writing there, and people started discussing him again. So he emerged as a writer. He was a senior writer. I think Hindi has celebrated his centenary only 2 or 3 years ago. He was that senior, and a very important writer of the 1940s and later. And this person, joined Shamsher Bahadur Singh, another great writer. He also, turned towards the little magazines. So a kind of new trend, a new development occurred in Hindi in the 1970s, and in fact 1970 is supposed to be as important a period in the history of Hindi writing as was the 1930s, when Premchand was at the height of his career. And so there are 2 decades which are of importance in Hindi writing. One is 1930s, and the one is 1970s. And in these 2 periods, particularly 1970, the emphasis was on some kind of a discussion about ideas, discussion about relevance of literature, discussion about serious engagement of writing with the issues of the day. That is what was being emphasized, and this was done in the 1970s in a new way, and this in fact turned the tide against the Cold War thinking, the Cold War ideology, the Cold War attitudes that were rampant till 1960. So this is the other development, and then there is a decline. I come to the I have still I think 10-15 minutes to cover the period 1980s, 1990s, and later, and I think in the light of what I have said now, I can do that fairly.
Sir, I would like to ask you a question. So we just learned from you the 1970s emergence of little magazines. So those who could not find favor with the big publication houses, publishing houses, they could talk about issues relevant to them, the values of independence we were talking about, idea of social justice, equality. Those now started publishing in the little magazines, and other commercial magazines were boycotted. Well, of course, people were definitely writing in those magazines also, but I would assume that their popularity would reduce considerably.
Yes, of course. One evidence of this is that those so-called commercial magazines, which were quite popular, quite influential till the 1960s and 70s, now they have stopped publication. Now they are not there. I can cite these 2 examples. The Times of India famous magazine called Dharmyug.
Right.
This magazine is a closed publication, I think, in sometime in the 1990s. And Saptahik Hindustan, which was a Saptahik and brought out by the Birla Group, this also came to an end. Now they are not there. So of course, 1970s put this kind of a pressure on the publications of big corporate houses in Hindi, who found that perhaps people would not read them as well as they were doing earlier. So they lost their influence, they lost their appeal, and finally they discontinued publication. So this is what happened. Today, I don't think corporate houses bring any important magazine in Hindi. There are some news magazines, of course. There is India Today, but imagine India Today being published in Hindi also, and the name is India Today. So it's that kind of a thing. Earlier it was Saptahik Hindustan, so it was called Saptahik, but now it is the other house brings out this magazine. So you see, now of course Hindi is facing a great deal of crisis. The writers, many of them may not even know about it, but the crisis is such, that writers write, they also publish, but nobody reads them. And they themselves also do not read the writing of others, except their friends or except their enemies, and some of them. So that writing habit, which was a part and parcel of understanding of Hindi literature in the 1960s and 70s, that is completely disappeared. So I'm just entering that area. 1970s left such an impact on the educated readership. Of course, it was not the readership of the common masses. Little magazines never reached, the common reader. They were fewer in number, and the print order also would not be beyond 1,000 copies, and nobody would buy those copies because they mainly talked about ideas. So they had an influence on the writing, on the community of writers in India. And because writers were veering towards them all the time, therefore these magazines became quite powerful in the literary circles. And when that became important, and that became the condition for any writing to be recognized in Hindi, so all the young writers of the 1970s and later, they shifted their interest from the big magazines, which were in any case closing down, to the little magazines. And what interestingly, viewers, what happened in the 1980s in Hindi was that many of the people with means and resources, like there is a whole lobby in Hindi among Hindi writers of bureaucrats. So they are big officers, they are IS officers, etc. But they also write, and then they have resources. So they started sponsoring certain supposedly little magazines. These little magazines these days, there is a joke in Hindi. The little magazines sometimes have as many as 300 pages, and they are published beautifully. Print, the print quality is very good, and sometimes they also have colored pages of transparencies of paintings there, and they are not very highly priced. I think 100 rupees a copy of a 200 or 300 page magazine would not be much of a price, but then there is so much of material and nobody is reading it, and people only read if somebody writes about them, and so this is 1980s. So those little magazines have turned into magazines which are very well printed and which are mainly for circulation, and where once again the people with resource have taken over. Now that is the trend of the writing in the 1980s. The other trend is, and that has affected Hindi criticism of the 1980s and 90s. Now I'm entering this area, is that there is a kind of practice in Hindi, starting from 1980 onwards, that thrives on getting the books reviewed, getting them talked about, so that the writers get help to win awards. And it's a new development that's happening in Hindi, that every state academy has its own Hindi academy. Like Delhi has an academy, UP has an academy, Rajasthan has an academy, Punjab, Haryana, all of them have academies, and they have all instituted prizes. So writers now are competing with one another, and they are all the time standing in the queue for getting these awards. And how do you get the awards? Sometimes I fail to understand that these people first get their books reviewed, then they get copies of them photostated, then they attach them along with the book and they send it for the award committee. So this is what is happening. So in the 1980s, and they are writing, in the language and the vocabulary of the 1970s. So they talk about commitment, they talk about humanism, they talk about rationality, they talk about anti-market, they talk about all those things, but nobody takes them seriously, and they don't bother because they are the talk of the town. So somebody, some critic with some name, this critic is called and he makes adulatory speech. They are about them. So this person's speech is read out elsewhere, and this person or these people, that category, they have a name, to reckon with in the award committees. So they give certificates to writers, and writers happily accept these certificates, and they are writing for awards. So this is what is happening in the 1980s and 90s. So finally, the last phase is the 1990s and 2000 to 2010 or 15, the last 15 years. And now what is happening is that there is a kind of discontent among writers, young writers, even about the present trend. This discontent is weak at the moment. In the 1990s, when we are reaching towards privatization, the happy thing about the writing in 1980s and 90s is that almost all writing, without exception, is against the forces of the market, is against the forces of privatization. They talk about neoliberalism, they go against it. Even the so-called bourgeois writers, they say that there should be humanism, etc. And the crisis is that one says all the right things, as one says in English, they make all kinds of right noises, but beyond that nothing gets achieved, and therefore the writing of the and the criticism of the 1980s and 90s is a criticism that is adulatory. And generally, you review, if you are getting the book reviewed by a critic, then you have to please that that reviewer or the critic, and the critic obliges. Therefore, the critic is not the critic who can point out certain faults and flaws in the approach of the writer, because then this critic will not be approached by the writer. So it's a very strange kind of crisis that is taking place, that criticism is losing its sheen. Criticism is losing its strength in the 1980s and 90s, and today, and critics are not taken seriously. But at the same time, let me tell you, viewers, that if there is anything that is important in today's writing, it is criticism. In the sense, that among the plethora of critical writings, there emerge every year at least 4 or 5 books or 10 books, and these books, tell the developments in a critical way, and it is these which draw attention. They draw attention not of the award givers, but they don't bother about it. So the books are published, and actually these books are sought after and bought. For instance, I can refer to a book that is written about the life of Mukti Bodh. It came out last year, and I've forgotten the title of the book. And this book is sought after, just because it's about Mukti Bodh, and it's somebody who knew him, somebody who moved around with him. That person has given the book the form of reminiscence. So the book is sold. Why? Because the book is about Mukti Bodh. The same way, there must be 10-15 books every year coming like this, and it is these books which are about writers who have not given in to the temptations of awards, or who don't bother. For instance, there is a critic, he is no more, critic called Om Prakash Grewal. He was a professor of English in Guru Kurukshetra University. He published a book, and his book is still in demand. It's called Vichardhara of Sahitya. I refer to that other writer called Chandrabhushan Tiwari, and his book is in demand today. So there is a critic called Surendra Chaudhary who died recently. His book also is in demand. So these writers are there. Chandrabali Singh, who didn't write for a long time. Towards the end, he wrote a number of books, and those books are in demand. So what I'm saying is that Hindi criticism is quite important even today. And people are, searching for these books written by the critics. The only thing is that as time passes, their number is decreasing, and now is the time. I can go with that particular quote, that there is a problem that Hindi criticism is facing, and the problem is that it is being drowned in the noise of adulatory reviewing and explanation. So I'm sure that soon there will be a kind of disenchantment with the present trend of popular critical writing, and people will come back to the worth of ideas. They will know that writing has to be fearless, writing has to be courageous, writing has to be enlightening, and that kind of writing only can survive. So with the viewers, this final analysis that there is a crisis, but there is also a situation in which the crisis will be finally understood and properly answered. That possibility is there. So on this positive note, I come to the end of the discussion.
Sir, thank you for such a promising idea that there is still hope, and I am sure that viewing this lecture, the readers would realize the potential of Hindi criticism and would like to read more of it. And friends, with this we would like to take your leave. This was our lecture on recent developments in Hindi criticism. We shall be back with more lectures, and I would like to just tell you that tomorrow is our last lecture as part of our series on writing in India. So I am sure you would like to view that as well. So with this we take your leave. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you, friends. Have a wonderful day ahead.